This is the Washington Week Webcast Extra.
Hello and welcome to the Washington Week Webcast Extra. I'm joined around the table by Susan Davis of USA Today, Yochi Dreazen of Foreign Policy Magazine, and Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post. The trauma, or drama, in South Carolina has had moral overtones, but also political ones, especially for three South Carolina lawmakers: Paul Thurmond, the state legislator and son of the late U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond; Lindsey Graham, the U.S. Senator now running for president; and Nikki Haley, the state's governor. Haley, in particular, was front and center. And let's face it, her political stock rose as well, didn't it, Karen?
Oh, I think so. I was in Charleston last week, and I was really struck by the almost grace with which everyone in the state, it feels like, came together, and the way they handled themselves. And you know, Nikki Haley got out there and called for the flag to come down, and those numbers in the legislature were huge. And I did spend a fair amount of time with Paul Thurmond, the son of Strom Thurmond, a state senator who's grown up with that last name that more than any other, I think, in modern state history has spoken to the politics of race and the politics, of segregation. And he really talked about, how this was a moment in history and that they had to seize it. And he cited the very Bible passage that the 9 people who were murdered in that church were studying that night. And it was the parable of the sower and how sometimes the ground is fertile.
I mentioned Lindsey Graham, but both U.S. senators from South Carolina called for the flag to come down and did it in a way, both of them Republican, one black, one white, and both of them went out of their way, it seems, to try to do that kind of knitting together. When Nikki Haley, however, was asked about whether this would make her better fodder for someone's vice presidential slot, she said this wasn't about her.
I really think, and when I arrived, the funerals were still going on, and I was standing outside the church and saw her come out, and you did get the sense. I mean, she stood there outside with the floral tributes, and she was just racked with grief. She was grieving along with her state, and so I do think that this is a moment where we ought to suspend our typical calculations.
Oh, for a minute. Okay, fine. I'll do that. Sue, I want to take you back up to Capitol Hill where you spend all of your time and talk about a lot of there's actually work kind of sort of getting done up there on big legislation. One, I think, that comes to mind for me is the highway bill, which after the Amtrak accident and after bridges fell down, we spent a lot of time talking about infrastructure. And the other is this obscure export-import bank, which requires explanation, but it also is important what's going to happen to it.
Yeah, it's become such a bizarre and interesting little fight in Congress over the export-import bank, which is a small federal agency that actually makes money and contributes to the Treasury and helps underwrite loans for companies to sell their products overseas. It has become an unusual litmus test for conservatives who have seen it become a symbol of what they would say is crony capitalism, corporate welfare, and they want to get rid of it. And it has become more of an ideological struggle right now in the Republican Party that I think largely exists inside the confines of the Beltway. This is not something that you hear about when you go talk to regular people about Boeing getting, loans underwritten by the government. But outside groups, particularly groups like the Americans for Prosperity that's affiliated with the Koch brothers that seek to eliminate government regulations and bureaucracy. And it's come up a lot on the presidential and the campaign trail. Most of the presidential candidates are now saying that they believe the bank should have to go away. It's become sort of like after the financial crisis, if you remember the Audit the Fed movement, how that became this sort of conservative cry. The Export-Import Bank is the new target. Now, what's unusual about it is that it has a majority of support in Congress. So Congress continues to be dysfunctional, and even the things they agree on can't really get through. So the transportation bill is a must-pass bill. We have to fund our highways. Probably not as much as most people would like to see it funded, but it's the must-pass bill. And so they're going to try and attach this Export-Import Bank onto at least a short-term funding bill and try and revive it that way. But it's going to be a big fight, and if they can't get it done, then we'd be in a position where our highway trust fund's running out, and then that's something real people are actually going to start to care about.
Let's talk about timing.
When projects start to go dry.
We're mid-July, so what's the timing on getting this done?
The bank has already expired. The bank expired at the end of June, so if they do it, they're going to be retroactively reviving the charter. The highway trust fund runs out at the end of this month. As we all know, Congress leaves town for the month of August, happily so. So they have about 2 weeks to try and resolve at least a short term. If they don't do the Ex-Im Bank on the short term, it's possible it may just go away.
Okay. Well, we'll be watching that over the next 2 weeks then. Yochi, I want to talk to you about some testimony yesterday. The new incoming, or at least nominee to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff went to Congress, went to Capitol Hill, and had a confirmation hearing in which he said a couple of unusual things about, at least he went further than I've heard the administration go, about our relationship in particular with Russia.
It was interesting. So he was asked about the 4 top threats to the United States. He was asked.
Dunford is.
Sorry, his name is Joe Dunford. He'd been the top commander in Afghanistan. He's a Marine. And the number 1 threat in his mind was Russia, which raised eyebrows around the room, but also the language he used. He said that Russia could pose, in his words, an existential threat to the United States. He talked about Russia that was assertive, not just in parts of Eastern Europe that we think of like Ukraine, but right on the border of NATO countries, and if Russia were to move into a NATO country, there would need to be a U.S. response. So he talked about Russia as the main threat to the United States, which is not what the White House would like to say. They don't want to think new Cold War. They'd like to think things with Russia will eventually calm down.
So what's he based that on?
He's basing it, I think, on what he's hearing from a lot of his commanders who are very deeply worried about Russian warplanes that are flying very dangerously close to NATO planes. Russia has sent nuclear submarines to Sweden. Sweden spent some time trying to find a nuclear sub that had been spotted off its coast. There are Russian warships going deeper and deeper into waters outside of Europe, off the coast of Europe. So they're seeing provocative actions that aren't simply Vladimir Putin with his shirt off riding a bear like you typically see, but it's actually the Russian military doing kind of scary things.
To what degree does the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff raising this question kind of poke at that bear?
It's a very good question, and the related question is, to what degree does it poke at the White House? You know, the White House has to eventually respond when they're asked. So your top military advisor says Russia is the biggest threat to the United States. Discuss. So if it's General Dunford talking to the White House, that has one set of impacts. If it's General Dunford talking with Moscow listening, frankly, I think Vladimir Putin would love to hear this. He would love to hear that he's being seen as the main threat to the United States. He sees himself that way. That means in his mind, Russia has again become, like during the Cold War, a world hyperpower. Maybe I'm wrong, but I find it hard to believe that this isn't coordinated in some way, that the White House doesn't mind a little good cop, bad cop with Russia. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it's bad cop, bad cop. I don't know. We'll see. We'll be watching. Thank you, everybody. And thank you all for watching as well. While you're online, check out everything else our panelists are covering in News You Need to Know. We post it every day at pbs.org/Washington Week. And we'll see you next time on the Washington Week Webcast Extra.